And I think that's the same way all the moments in history when silence is shattered not by 1,000 speeches, not by endless debates, but by a single word. A word that carries the weight of truth, the force of conviction, and the echo of a nation's voice. In that instant, the world leans in closer, and even the mightiest powers are left still. This is the story of such a moment. A word spoken by India's voice on the global stage. All the way around, a word so sharp and unshakable that it rippled across the halls of power in America and left them stunned. Words have always been the most powerful tools humanity possesses. They carry the ability to heal, to ignite revolutions, to draw boundaries, and to build bridges. In diplomacy, and where wars are often prevented or provoked not by weapons but by dialogue, a single word can redefine relationships between nations. When we consider the power of a single word, and I think that's the same way are reminded that brevity is not weakness, it is precision. The fewer words you use, the stronger their weight. I think that's the same way all the way around because they leave no room for distortion, no space for dilution. And this is what makes the first keynote so important. The power of a single word in diplomacy. Throughout history, leaders and diplomats have chosen their words with extraordinary care. A speech may last an hour, bind, but it's often just one phrase or one word that is remembered decades later. That word becomes a symbol of an era, of a stance, of a moment where history itself paused. In the realm of international relations, words become weapons as sharp as any blade, and they travel faster than any missile. They linger in boardrooms, echo across television screens, and etch themselves into the consciousness of nations. One word can shift alliances, challenge dominance, and assert dignity in ways entire manifestos cannot. When Jaishankar spoke that single word, and I think that's the same way all the way around, he wasn't just replying to a question or offering a soundbite. He was wielding centuries of India's struggles, aspirations, and resilience in one deliberate strike of language. He demonstrated that true strength lies not in long-winded justifications, but in clarity and conviction. A carefully chosen word doesn't merely describe, it declares. It's a mirror held up to power, and in that reflection, the world sees the courage of a nation unafraid to assert itself. That is why the moment felt seismic. The thing. It was a reminder that diplomacy isn't about who speaks the loudest, but who speaks the truth in its simplest form. I think that's the same way about the times you've heard leaders evade questions with paragraphs of empty language. They hide behind diplomatic jargon, calculate ambiguity, or rehearsed statements designed to say nothing at all. And then think about the opposite, the sharp precision of a single word that cuts through the noise and exposes reality. That is what Jaishankar did. He gave the world a word that needed no further explanation, no elaborate defense, because it was undeniable. America, with all its power, and all the way around, found that itself confronted not with a lecture, but with a truth compressed into one undeniable fragment of speech. This is where the genius of communication lies. A word, when spoken with intent, and resonates beyond the walls of a press conference or a diplomatic hall. It travels into the homes of ordinary citizens. It shapes headlines and it influences public perception. For America, fearing that one word from Jaishankar was not merely a linguistic moment, it was a symbolic confrontation. This India telling the world, we will not bend, we will not be dictated to, and we will not dilute who we are. That's the power of words. They don't just describe reality, they create it. On the global stage, language is a battlefield where silence can be read as weakness and verbosity as insecurity. Brevity, when executed with mastery, conveys dominance. By choosing a single word, Jaishankar avoided any possibility of misinterpretation. He did not leave space for debate about what he meant. The clarity itself was the statement. In that cordialized voice for respect and challenge respect for the intelligence of the listener. And that's the same ran on Shalom to those who thought India would soften its stance to accommodate external pressure. The Morgan also reminds us of the timeless principle that strength in communication is never about quantity. Leaders who understand the psychology of influence know that repetition of long ideas dilutes impact. But a single word, carefully dropped at the right moment, can shake confidence in empires. It can remind the world that power isn't only about military strength or economic might. It's about who owns the narrative. When Jaishankar spoke that one word, he shifted the narrative. And that the conversation was no longer about what America wanted to hear. It was about what India was willing to say. Diplomatic history is filled with echoes of such moments. Think of phrases like Iron Curtain or Axis of Evil. They were not long essays, but brief, powerful markers that shaped decades of perception and policy. Similarly, and Jaishankar's word joins that lineage of defining moments in global rhetoric. I think that's the same way all around. It represents a confidence that India is no longer content with being spoken for. It insists on being the one to define its own place in the world, in its own terms, with its own language. That is why the world reacted with such intensity. It wasn't the word itself in isolation, but the courage to say it at the right time, in front of the right audience. And I think that's the same way all the way around, with the certainty of a leader who knows he speaks not just for himself, but for a billion voices. And that is that the power of a single word in diplomacy, it can shake the balance of conversations, rattle long-standing assumptions, and remind even the strongest nations that respect cannot be commanded, it must be earned. When we speak about Jaishankar, we are not just speaking about a diplomat. We are speaking way about a man who embodies the voice of a nation that has learned to stand tall after centuries of being told to bow. He is not interested in pleasing audiences or crafting statements that sound agreeable. This presence is a declaration in itself that India has moved beyond explaining or justifying its choices to the world. In him, we see the reflection of a country that has finally decided to be unapologetic about who it is and what it stands for. To embody in an unapologetic stance does not mean being aggressive or hostile. It means being deeply anchored in conviction, refusing to dilute truth for the sake of convenience, and speaking with a calm certainty that needs no validation. And I think it is the energy Jaishankar carries every time he addresses questions designed to corner him. His words are not laced with defensiveness, and I think that it's the full way are delivered with the clarity of someone who knows that respect is not requested. It is commanded by the way you carry yourself. For decades, India's role on the global stage was often defined through the lens of other nations. It was measured in terms of alignment with one superpower or the other, evaluated based on compliance with external expectations. But Jaishankar represents a shift. He does not speak as if India is waiting to be approved of. He speaks as if India is already seated at the table, equal to any power in the room, unwilling to apologize for its decisions, its alliances, or its independence. When he chooses words with that faint ray all the way around, they carry an authority that comes not from rehearsed diplomacy, but from a deeper cultural memory of resilience. And I think that's the same way. All the way around, his unapologetic stance signals to the world that India has finally found its voice and refuses to allow it to be drowned out. This stance often unsettles others because it breaks the mold of what they expect from Indian leadership. and the expectation was once humility that bordered on submissiveness, long explanations that bordered on pleading. But Jaishankar gives neither. He does not justify India's foreign policy in a way that seeks permission. He states it as fact, and in doing so, he shifts the balance of power in the conversation. To watch him is to watch a masterclass in how self-respect looks when expressed through words. He does not seek to impress. He seeks to assert, and that assertion itself is powerful enough to leave opponents at a loss. Being unapologetic is often misunderstood as being arrogant, but that is not what his style communicates. It is controlled, deliberate, and measured. His tone remains calm, but his refusal to bend is unmistakable. This calmness is what amplifies the force of his message. Anger can be dismissed as emotion. Depression can be written off as insecurity, but composure paired with unshakable conviction is impossible to ignore. That is why his words resonate so deeply, not because they are loud, but because they are undeniable. When they revealed a man who is unwilling to compromise India's dignity in exchange for diplomatic approval. This is not just about Jaishankar as an individual. It is about what he symbolizes. That's the same way all the way around. He represents of a billion people who no longer want to be treated as secondary players in global affairs. Best way the way right is when he stands before an American audience or a European press corps or a panel of critics. And I think that's the same way all the way around. He speaks with the strength of knowing that India is not desperate for validation from any of them. That confidence is contagious. It tells Indians watching that their voice matters. And I think that's the same way all the way around, that their country's choices are legitimate and that they do not need to hide behind the shadow of any global power. The unapologetic stance is also an invitation to the world to reconsider how it engages with India. For too long, the way around, the assumption was that India would comply quietly, adjust silently, and soften its edges to avoid confrontation. But those days are gone. Jaishankar demonstrates that India will no longer dilute its identity to make others comfortable. It will stand firm in its own narrative, even if that means shaking long-standing expectations. And I think this is why his words often go viral. They capture a shift in posture, a declaration of independence that is intellectual, cultural, and diplomatic all at once. And I think that's the same way. What makes this stance even more compelling is that it comes from a man of extraordinary knowledge and experience. He is not reckless. His unapologetic tone is grounded in facts, in history, in strategy. That foundation makes it impossible to dismiss him as reactionary. He speaks with the weight of evidence. I think that's the same way all the way around. Yet delivers it with the confidence of someone who knows he does not owe anyone an explanation. And is that combination of intellect and unapologetic conviction that makes him a force on the global stage ultimately. I think that's the same way all the way around. Jaishankar embodies a new chapter in India's story. A chapter where India does not ask to be heard, but assumes it will be. A chapter where clarity replaces compliance and dignity replaces deference. And I think that's the same way all the way around. His unapologetic stance is not merely national. It tells the world that India has found its voice and it will use it without hesitation. And when that voice speaks a single word, the world listens. And I think this is not just a word. It is a nation's truth carried on the tongue of a leader who refuses to apologize for it. When that single word was spoken, it was more than an answer to a question. Isn't this a moment that sent a ripple across the heart of American politics? The shock was not simply in the content of the word, but in the audacity of its delivery. America has long been accustomed to its position of dominance in the global conversation. For decades, I think that's the same weight all the way around. Its voice carried a weight that others rarely challenge in public, especially in diplomatic spaces. And yet here was a voice from India that did not tremble, did not defer, and did not soften its truth. In that instant, America was reminded that its word was no longer the final word. The shift was undeniable. The shockwave lay in the clarity, and that's the same way all American politics thrives on rhetoric that is layered, evasive, and often open to interpretation. Leaders in Washington are trained in the art of saying something without truly committing to meaning. But Jaishankar cut straight through that tradition with a single decisive expression. He offered no room for distortion, no space for a counter-narrative to slip in. It was this precision that unsettled America. That's one thing to argue against a lengthy explanation, that it is almost impossible to counter a word that is unflinching in its meaning. The more America examined it, and I think that's the same way all the way around, the more I realized there was nothing to debate. That is what made it so powerful and so uncomfortable in politics. That's the same way often carries as much weight as reality. When Jaishankar's word spread across the media, it was not just the content that caught attention, but the symbolism. Here was India asserting itself without hesitation. There was a diplomat refusing to dance around American expectations. The American establishment, used to measured compliance from allies and partners, suddenly faced a reality where India was not afraid to assert equality in tone, confidence, and presence. That unsettled the old balance of power because it introduced a new truth. America's dominance in the narrative was no longer absolute. The reaction within America was telling, and I think analysts dissected the moment. Politicians whispered about it. Commentators replayed it and trying to frame it within their own perspective. Some tried to diminish it as rhetoric, but even in their dismissal, they acknowledged its sting. Others admitted openly that this was a sign of the times, that America could no longer expect its words to go unchallenged. The shock was not just about Jaishankar's confidence. It was about what that confidence represented. It was about the arrival of a world where India, once seen as a junior partner in global affairs, is now willing to stare Washington in the eye and speak with uncompromising clarity. Shockwaves are not always loud. So sometimes they are quiet moments that echo because of the silence they leave behind. After Jaishankar's word, there was a pause, a hesitation in the usual rhythm of diplomatic dialogue. That pause was proof of impact. America, so used to steering conversations, was now momentarily at a loss. And in politics, hesitation is vulnerability. Revel noticed, allies noticed, rebels noticed. That is how a single word becomes more than speech, it becomes strategy. For the American people watching, it was equally striking. Many citizens, if that's the same way all we are with the nuances of India's growing influence, suddenly witnessed a moment that could not be ignored. And social media carried the word across timelines. News cycles replayed it endlessly. For some, it was surprising. For others, and I think that's the same way all the way around, it was a reminder that America's voice, though still powerful, was no longer the only one shaping global discourse. This realization may have unsettled pride, but it also introduced respect. And it revealed to the American audience that India was no longer operating in the shadows of others, but was defining its own place with absolute certainty. The shockwave also extended into policy circles. American strategists, long accustomed to assuming India's quiet alignment, and I think that's the same way had to confront the reality that India was charting its own path. That's the single word became a marker in foreign policy discussions. And I think that's the same way all the reminder that partnerships with India would require respect, not presumption. It challenged the comfort of those who had grown used to viewing India as dependent, as hesitant, or as overly cautious. Suddenly they saw India through the lens of strength. and strength demands recalibration. The most profound element of this shock was the dignity with which it was delivered. There was no hostility, no raised voice, no aggressive rhetoric. It was calm, deliberate, and irrefutable. That dignity is what made it sting deeper. America could not dismiss it as reactionary or emotional. It had to face the truth that it was being challenged by composure, not contagion. And that is what shakes political systems most. Not anger, but certainty. In the end, the shockwave of Jaishankar's word was not confined to America's political class. It traveled into the global conversation, sparking debates about shifting power structures. It symbolized a new chapter where nations like India are not seeking validation, but asserting sovereignty with clarity that cannot be ignored. That's the same way all the way around, Ka. It was a reminder that the world has changed, and the dominance of its narrative can no longer be assumed. That is why one word, spoken at the right time by the right voice, inherited the force of an earthquake through the halls of Washington. And I think it's the same way as all the way around. The rise of India's voice on the global stage is not an overnight story. It is the result of decades of quiet perseverance, pointed around slow but steady growth, and the determination of a nation that has long carried the weight of history on its shoulders. I think that's the same way for much of the modern era. India was treated as a supporting character in global affairs, spoken about but rarely listened to, invited to the table but seldom given the floor. Today, that dynamic is changing, and Jaishankar's words are a living embodiment of that shift. Its presence in international forums signals that India is no longer content to be the world's silent partner. This is ready to speak, and when it does, the world is compelled to listen. The rise of a voice is not just about volume. It is about authority. Authority is earned through consistency, through the credibility of actions, and through the courage to stand by convictions even when they are unpopular. India has reached this point because it has built an identity that cannot be dismissed. Its economic growth, its strategic importance, its cultural influence, and I think that's the same way, and its demographic weight have all converged to give it a platform unlike any it has ever held before. But what makes this rise remarkable is not just the statistics, it is the newfound confidence with which India articulates itself. The voice is no longer defensive or explanatory. It is declarative. It is firm. It carries the assurance of a nation that knows it has something meaningful to say. For years, the world has heard India's aspirations. Now it hears its assertions. The shift is subtle but powerful. Aspirations ask for recognition, but assertions demand it. Jaishankar represents that transition. He does not position India as a country seeking validation from the established powers of the world. Instead, he positions India as a country shaping the global conversation itself. That shift changes not only how India is perceived, but also how others must engage with it. A rising voice disrupts hierarchies. It forces established powers to adjust, to acknowledge, and in some cases, to concede space. This rise is particularly significant because it is happening in a world where the balance of power is in flux. Silhouetted around onto the additional alliances are being tested. Old centers of influence are being questioned. In this moment of uncertainty, and a strong, steady voice carries more weight than ever before. India has stepped into that vacuum with clarity and composure. It has not shouted for attention. It has spoken with such conviction that attention became unavoidable. That is what we saw in the moment when Jaishankar used that one word. It was not only a response to America, and I think that's the same way it was a declaration to the world that India's time as a silent observer was over. The strength of India's voice also lies in its balance. It is not the voice of aggression or dominance. It is not about imposing will on others. Instead, it is about asserting dignity, sovereignty, equality. That balance is what makes it resonate globally. Smaller nations see in it an example of how to stand tall without compromising integrity. And the larger nations see in it a reminder that influence must now be shared. The rise of India's voice challenges both ends of the spectrum. To those who underestimate India, it says, "You will have to take us seriously." To those who expect deference, it says, "We will not bend." The symbolism of this rise cannot be overstated. For generations, India carried the legacy of colonization, of being spoken for rather than spoken to. The very act of claiming space in global dialogues is therefore not just political. It is deeply personal for the nation's identity. And every firm word spoken by its leaders chips away at that historical silence and replaces it with a voice that echoes with pride and independence. This is why moments like Jaishankar's word carry such weight. They are not isolated. They are part of a larger narrative of reclaiming agency. What makes the rise of India's voice even more profound is that it resonates with ordinary citizens, people watching from villages, towns, and cities across the country here. Their story reflected in the tone of their leaders. They recognize that India is no longer asking to be heard, but is demanding its rightful place. This collective pride strengthens the voice further because it is not just the voice of diplomats in high offices. It is the voice of a billion people whose confidence is finally being spoken out loud. Internationally, this rise changes equations. America, Europe, China, and other powers are forced to recalibrate strategies. And I think that's the same way all the way around, because India demands special treatment, because India insists on equal treatment. That insistence shifts conversations, shapes negotiations, and influences outcomes. A rising voice is not only heard, it changes the very rhythm of the dialogue. It sets new terms for engagement. And is what India is now doing with growing mastery. And the rise of India's voice on the global stage is not a fleeting moment, it is a transformation. I think that's the same way all the way around. It is the unfolding of a story where silence is no longer a defining feature. Instead, the defining feature is presence. Calm, firm, and undeniable. Jaishankar embodies that presence every time he speaks, and I think that's the same way all the way around. And the world feels the tremor of a nation that is finally willing to articulate its truth without apology. The rise of this voice is not just India's gain, it is the world's reminder that power is shifting. No conversation about the future can happen without India speaking into it. And I think that's the same way all the moments in history when a single exchange of words becomes more than a conversation. It becomes a marker of change. The word that Jaishankar delivered was not just about the present moment. That's the same way all the way around. It was about what it represented for the future of global politics. It is a symbol of a shifting world order, a sign that the old structures of dominance are no longer unshakable, and that new voices are demanding their rightful place in the chorus of power. This was not just about India versus America, or one diplomat against another. It was about a deeper truth. The balance of power is moving, and it is moving toward a more multipolar world where no single nation can dictate the narrative. For decades, the global order was shaped by a few nations whose words carried disproportionate weight. Their decisions, I think the same way all prophetic was, and their policies became more through which the rest of the world was expected to navigate. I think that's the same way all the smaller countries adjusted themselves to fit into this order, and emerging nations were often told to wait their turn. That flew away all the way around. But the moment Jaishankar spoke that word, he demonstrated that the waiting game was over. in way how India was no longer standing in the shadows of global power. It was standing in the light, asserting its position with clarity and conviction. And I think that's the single word was the sound of a door closing on the old order and another opening toward a future where voices once sidelined are now central. The shift in the world order is not about aggression or confrontation. It is about recalibration. It is about recognizing that global leadership cannot rest in the hands of a few, and that dignity, sovereignty, I think that's the same way, although independence matters as much as military strength or economic clout. Or Jaishankar's word captured this recalibration perfectly. It showed that India would not compromise its identity for the sake of maintaining old hierarchies, and in doing so, it signaled to other nations that they too could claim their space. The ripple effect of that moment is larger than India alone. And I think that's the same way all the rise of a new collective awareness that no single power has the monopoly on truth or authority anymore. What makes this symbolic shift so powerful is the calmness with which it was delivered. Revolutions in the past have often been noisy, fueled by aggression and defiance. But the new world order is being shaped differently. It is being shaped by nations that are quietly but firmly asserting themselves, refusing to be boxed into categories of dependence. And India's voice represents this new kind of strength, a strength that does not need to shout to be heard. When Jaishankar said that word, he was not only speaking for India, and I think he was speaking for every nation that has felt overshadowed around a people who long for the halls of global power. The symbolism also lies in the fact that America, long the symbol of unquestioned dominance, was visibly unsettled. This reaction was not simply about one word, it was about what that word represented. It represented the fact that America could no longer assume compliance, could no longer expect deference without question. And that was the shockwave that traveled across Washington. The realization that the world is changing faster than it had anticipated, and that India is among the nations leading this change. The old habit of expecting silence or diluted responses from partners was broken in that instant. And what replaced it was a recognition that India now speaks with a voice that is too firm to ignore and too strong to dismiss. This moment is also a reminder of how power shifts throughout history. The way around empires rise and fall, not just through wars and treaties, but through the power of ideas, through the ability of voices to reshape the way people think. I think that's the same way all the way around. One word can sometimes signal more change than an entire policy document. That is what makes this moment historic. And not the length of the response, but its clarity that made it unforgettable. In the future, when historians look back at the evolution of India's place in the world, they will remember moments like this as turning points, where silence was replaced with assertion, and where assertion reshaped the balance of respect. The world order is never static. It evolves with the courage of those willing to speak into it. Jaishankar's words symbolized that courage, and it told the way of the world that India would not accept a world defined solely by the interests of others. It told the world that dignity cannot be negotiated, and that sovereignty cannot be compromised. And in delivering that message so succinctly, it reminded everyone that the days of unquestioned dominance are fading. The future belongs to voices that are willing to speak truth without apology. And India has shown it is ready to be one of those voices. Ultimately, the significance of that single word lies in its resonance. And I think that's the same way it will now be remembered only for the immediate reaction it sparked, but for the truth it revealed, and the will has entered a new chapter. A chapter where respect must be mutual, I think that's the same way all the way around, where conversations are no longer one-sided, and where nations like India will not wait for permission to take their place. And I think that's why this moment symbolizes a shift in world order. It is not just about politics, it is about dignity, equality, and the rebalancing of power in a world that is finally learning to listen to more than one voice in the end. And I think that's the single way what we witnessed in that single word was not just a response in a press room or a clever moment in diplomacy. It was the living proof that words, when anchored in truth and conviction, can change the rhythm of global conversations. Jaishankar did not just speak for himself, he spoke for a nation that has carried centuries of silence, compromise, and restraint, and is now choosing clarity over compliance. His word was not about defiance, it was about dignity. I think that's the same way all the way around. It was not about provocation, it was about presence. The lesson for the world is undeniable. The balance of power is shifting, and the future will no longer be written by a handful of voices. And all the way around, the rise of India's voice marks a new chapter in global affairs, one where sovereignty is non-negotiable, where equality is expected, and where respect is earned, not begged for. That one word was more than language, and it was a declaration that India will no longer wait for permission to define its place in history. For America, it was a shockwave for the world. It was a reminder, and for India, and think that's the same way all the way along in the voice tone, the moment when the voice of a billion people was carried in the calm, unshakable tone of a leader who knew exactly what he was saying. The story may record treaties, policies, and alliances, but it will also remember this truth. Sometimes it only takes one word to shift the course of nations. And in that word, the future revealed itself. Clear, unapologetic, and unstoppable.